Hey folks, welcome to this episode of Sound Decisions here on Passion for Sound. If you're not familiar with the Sound Decisions series, it's designed to give you information that's going to help you in your audio journey to work out what's right for you in your purchasing decisions, when you're watching reviews, trying to decipher information out there about this hobby, any sort of situation where extra information is helpful. You've probably never seen me quite this dressed up before. I had a work call this morning and decided to quickly jump in and record this video while I was all dressed up for my work call. So I'll be back to the normal t-shirts and hoodies for future, but here I am in my work attire. Apologies as well that some of this video, the video quality is going to be slightly overexposed. I apologize for that. I'll do my best to reduce any hotspots, particularly on my shiny forehead up here, so I'll do my best to fix that throughout the rest of the video. For this episode of Sound Decisions, I want to talk to you about USB cables, testing them, measuring them, the experience of listening to different cables. It's an area that's quite controversial, and so I wanted to break down my experience in recent times trying to grapple with this topic for myself. Specifically, having reviewed a series of different USB cables and copping a fair bit of backlash via the comments from people that don't believe in cables, I decided it was time for me to try a different approach. And so I set up some blind listening tests, and they were really the trigger for this video today. I want to start off by saying a huge thank you to Welsper from StereoNet for lending me his Jashelli Labs J2, so I would have two identical DACs for this test. In total, I've set up 3 different blind testing setups, and all of them have had problems. And I'm not saying they had problems because I failed to hear anything, I'm saying they had problems because I failed to have any conclusive results. Let me talk you through what we tried and why the end result was a lack of conclusive evidence either way. I should say that whilst I started this process believing that I heard differences between USB cables, I was also uncertain enough, having seen some of the measurements, having seen some of the debate about why USB cables shouldn't make a difference, that I was honestly curious. So there was no bias or need for it to go a certain way. On one hand, I did want USB cables to sound better because obviously I'd said things out there in the world where I believed certain USB cables to sound better. But on the other hand, I would love to find out that they made no difference at all, because that way I could stop worrying about which one was the best and just plug in the generic printer cord. And so the setups that we did were as follows. First up, I had one single DAC, which was the Hugo TT2 if I remember correctly, and with that I was using 2 different USB cables. The idea being that I would have my wife help me by switching the USB cables and I wouldn't know which one was which. I would then have to try and identify which cable I thought was plugged in. Now I can't actually recall if it was the TT2 or maybe it was the Bifrost 2. Either way, it was one DAC with 2 different cables. The cables being used were a generic USB cable as supplied with most DACs, and I'm pretty sure the other one was the Curious Evolved USB cable, a very highly priced cable that I personally think sounds wonderful. But having said that, I was looking for proof as to whether it was just my own expectations and placebo, or whether there really was a difference. Sadly, the results both for me and for my wife, who tried the exact same test with no briefing at all from me, all I said to her is, I'm going to change cables, you tell me which one you think's plugged in. In both cases, neither of us could comfortably pick which cable was which. So we ended up with somewhere just over 50% accuracy, which is no better than chance. I then set up another test using the Jashelli Labs J2, so my J2, and Welsper from StereoNet's J2, and this time running the 2 DACs with the RCA outputs first of all into my bottlehead mainline. After playing around with that for myself, I wasn't comfortable I was going to be able to pick a difference. And so the final step was to move to the same general setup with the 2 Jashelli Labs J2 DACs, but this time running both of them from a single computer so we could have identical USB circuits, using Roon to send the same signal to both DACs at the same time, and then running both outputs into a switch box. So the idea was, within each round, the person listening to the music would decide which of the 2 inputs, input A or input B, had the better quality USB cable. Once again with that testing, the results we landed on was around about the 50 to 60% mark, which is no better than chance. So you might think at this point, well, that's pretty clear cut, USB cables make no difference. But the reason this video is not a clear-cut review of me sharing the exact testing process and where we landed on was that this process actually raised more questions than it provided answers. So where the biggest issue for me came into play was that whilst the numbers would say that we couldn't hear a difference, with no briefing at all, my wife described to me when I said to her, "Can you hear a difference? Do you think there's a difference?" She described to me exactly how I would have described the cable, but I hadn't told her any of this. She's watched none of my reviews on the cables before. She wouldn't have known which cable was which anyway. She's not into the audio hobby at all. And yet she described to me exactly the differences that I thought I perceived. And if you think about it, somebody could easily, if they had some expectation of difference, they could actually expect things like worse sound or better sound, brighter sound, darker sound, more space, less space, more image focus, less image focus. There are so many factors that she could have chosen to tell me, had it just been placebo, that the chances of her landing on the exact same description, the same general tonal qualities that she described to me and presentation qualities that she described to me, it's very unlikely that she would have landed on the same experiences that I had of the cable if there wasn't something going on. And so what it led me to think about was what was getting in the way of these blind tests being more effective. If we could both actually hear the differences when we were just taking our time to listen and explain what we were hearing, then why weren't we hearing the difference when we could take our time, flip back and forth between the two of them, and in theory hear the differences and identify which cable was plugged into which device? And the problem comes down to a few factors. One of the issues with critical listening like this is that listener fatigue kicks in really fast. Our ears aren't designed, and our brain and our auditory perception mechanisms aren't designed for extended periods of really tightly focused listening. We're generally designed for short, sharp focuses on a particular sound or a particular set of sounds to identify things like danger in the environment, where a sound's coming from, and then go back to just normal listening to the environment. So it's not part of our DNA, our evolutionary makeup, to have extended periods of very, very focused listening. So that's part one. Listener fatigue kicks in and makes it very hard to hear the fine details. Part two is expectation bias. The same mechanism that may be working against us when listening to these things not blind is also getting in the way when we listen to them blind. What I mean by that is when you're switching between input A and input B, you're actually looking for differences. You're looking to find certain things. And unfortunately, that plays tricks on our ears. There is no doubt that expectation bias is a real thing. The placebo effect and various other psychoacoustic effects are all very real. And so what I was finding was that, particularly in the first test that we did when it was one DAC and the cable was being switched, because you were going into it listening for details, you would actually focus on and hear things in the generic cable that made you think it was actually the better quality cable. And then you'd flip over and listen to things in the high quality cable, which of course you didn't know which cable you were listening to because it was a blind test. But again, you'd be listening for things and you would focus in and hear stuff that may not have been what you would have generally taken in had you just been casually listening. So that expectation of finding differences actually gets in the way of just being able to take in the whole auditory picture. I should mention at this point, none of this is intended as an excuse or a reason to discard results from any type of test. It's all meant to set the context for why one single type of testing is not enough in this hobby of ours. But continuing on, there's two other things I want to mention that limit the quality of blind test results. The next issue I wanted to talk about was the fact that additional pieces in the source chain are going to change how well you can hear the differences. In an analog source chain, generally the simpler and the shorter it is, the more transparent it will be. So when we go and add in something like my switching box here, which is just a basic one from Knob Sound, this plus the XLRs going into and out of it are adding extra elements to the source chain and reducing transparency. Therefore, it's possible that were we able to somehow magically switch the inputs without all of this extra circuitry along the way, we might be able to hear the differences more clearly. The next thing that is slightly related to that is also the level of gear that we're testing with. Now, Wellspur was kind enough to lend me his J2, but if I'm being honest, the J2 isn't the most resolving DAC in the world. It's a great DAC and I enjoy listening to it, but it is still a budget DAC. And there is no doubt in my mind, and I'm sure the folks at Trishelli Labs would also agree, that there are DACs on the market that have greater resolving power, whether it's a Bifrost 2, a Hugo TT2, or other things that are way, way higher up in the price range. So the point being here that depending on the products that you're using to listen to the blind testing setup, is going to change how well you're able to pick the differences. So all in all, the conclusions that I came to after doing this blind testing setup was that blind testing is equally as fallible, albeit for different reasons, than a sighted listening test, and also as fallible as measurement setups which don't take in the full picture of what we're able to hear. We actually don't understand everything that we can hear, and therefore we can't measure it. For example, there was a recent article that I came across that's starting to prove that somehow our brain does perceive information well above the 20 kilohertz mark. That doesn't mean we can hear it. It doesn't mean that we're in any way consciously aware of it. But when playing music with high frequency content, parts of the brain were lighting up on brain scans. When you're removing that same high frequency information, those parts of the brain were no longer lighting up. So my point is there's more going on than we understand. And therefore, if we don't understand it, we also can't measure for it. I'm not saying that high frequency stuff has anything to do with USB cables. I'm just using that to illustrate the point. So the conclusions that I landed on and that I wanted to share with you today are a few. Firstly, I still believe that USB cables do make a difference. The fact that my wife described to me the exact same perceptions that I had of the cable, despite having no way of knowing what I thought they sounded like in advance, that says to me something is going on. On the flip side of that, the differences are very, very small. The fact that we can't easily pick them in a blind test does mean that the differences are incremental. And therefore, USB cables are something that I still say and continue to say are not something you should worry about in the early days of your system. You will get much bigger bang for buck in upgrading your devices, so your DAC, your amp, definitely your headphones, and then even the analog cables I would go to before USB cables. But I am still on the hunt of finding a way of proving and identifying what is going on between one USB cable and the next, because to my experience, they do sound different. And finally, what this has also shown me and the conclusions that I've drawn is that blind testing is not the answer. Blind testing doesn't tell us all there is to know. Likewise, measurements don't tell us all there is to know. And then on top of that, there is a chance for bias, so sighted tests don't tell us all there is to know. What that means is the best thing you can do when you're making decisions is take into account all of the different sources of information out there, process them how you will, and ideally get your hands on the gear and try it out for yourself. Of course, in an ideal world, that doesn't mean buying it if you've got some way to audition it without spending the money first, or buy it from somewhere that you can send it back. Go into it with an open mind and make your own decisions. I hope you found this review useful. Hopefully it continues the conversation around USB cables and how and why they might sound different. Maybe we'll come up with better ways to test them in the future. But for now, I'll leave you to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.